Mark, it's great to have you on the show.
Thank you so much, Steve. I appreciate it.
Well, I've been following you on Twitter, and we had an earlier conversation as well. And you've got a great story. And I think that's where I would like to start is to get a little bit of your backstory in terms of how you got to where you are today. You're also a medical doctor, you're a Bitcoiner, and I think you've had a very interesting journey. So I'd love for you to start with however far back you'd like to go to tell us about who you are.
Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity for an introduction. I grew up in Iowa, moved up to Minnesota, Minneapolis, for my medical residency, and did my residency in internal medicine and have become a hospital medicine physician. That means that I only work in the hospital. I don't have a clinic. I don't have a panel of patients. And so I see everything that comes through the door, from little old ladies with urinary tract infections to broken hips to strokes and heart attacks and severe sepsis. And obviously, over the past 2 years, the spectrum of COVID related illness. And it's been an incredible position. I've been doing that for about 10 years and I really enjoyed it, but actively working on some transitions, and which we may talk about later. With respect to Bitcoin, I got into the space in 2017, January 1st, in fact, when I was at a friend's house and he had a Harvard Business Review magazine on the coffee table and was reading about blockchain and quickly realized it was going to be a technology that had merit. And so my immediate thoughts were, how would it apply in healthcare? And you start thinking about credentialing and medical records, things like that. So it was 2017. Obviously, many of us share that experience where we went through the ICO craze and got caught up in that. And I was very much a part of the narrative at the time, not understanding what Bitcoin was about, and got caught up in it's old technology narrative. So after, the crash, I felt burnt out. Like it was obsessive in 2017. And so I had to take a step back. But then it was mid to late 2018 when I revisited Bitcoin specifically. And I did so because of a desire to better understand money and what my relationship to money had been up until that point. And since then, it's like most of us, continue to be obsessive, and the rabbit hole ensued. So Minneapolis has been great. The job's been good. Bitcoin's been good. And the opportunities that I've had with it over the past year have been incredible. Met so many engaging people, including yourself. So I'm grateful for all of that.
I appreciate that. And one of the many interesting things about Bitcoin is that for most people, it's a journey or it's a path that you go down and it evolves over time. And I know you sent out a tweet here not too long ago, and I want to delve into it a little bit. And basically what you said in the tweet is that a number of years ago, you wanted to learn more about some of the big issues facing the world. And so I think you started learning about the three monotheistic faiths. You also wanted to learn more about racial justice, and you also wanted to know more about money. So I'd love for you to share a little bit about the journey. You can start wherever you want in those three areas. Why did you go down those paths? What did you learn? And as you reflect back on that, are there any insights that you've carried with you and that might carry forward with you as well?
So the desire to study about religion and race and money certainly did not occur all at one time. There were specific reasons and experiences that led to each one of those. Religion was the first one that I delved into, and obviously it's a topic that is of interest to all of us for the most part. I think my experience is unique, though. My father was a priest and my mother was a nun. So I grew up in the Catholic faith, but I fell pretty far from the tree. I no longer consider myself as such. But it wasn't until after, I think, 9/11, in the ensuing few years, when there was a great deal of Islamophobia, where both sides uh, specifically Christianity, Islam, were pointing fingers at each other with regard to who has the stronghold on truth. And you saw how it played out with regard to attacking both sides. And I wanted to better understand that dynamic. I wanted to better understand why religion was being brought into this situation. I wanted to better understand the dynamic and the historical dynamics, because obviously it wasn't the first time in which violence had been done in the name of religion. And so this was, gosh, close to 15 years ago, but I found Karen Armstrong's books to be incredibly valuable. The way that she took a humanistic approach to the study, the historical aspect, really trying to delve into who these individuals were as people and not trying to rationalize any sort of objective truth around their teachings. As far as what I took away from that study, I've a lot of the details I've since forgotten, but there are elements which stay with me. And one of the most important is the idea of the metaphor of it all. Very much a Joseph Campbell sentiment that all these writings are metaphors, and we should embrace that metaphor and the lessons that they have to teach us, right? So every religion has truth in it in one way or another. Is when we don't understand it as a metaphor that we get stuck and problems ensue. When we interpret them as facts, we run into these problems. And so, in a way, and we'll probably get to this later, I think that is in part what might be happening with Bitcoin as we look at it through these different lenses. These metaphors for Bitcoin become tribalistic affairs in a certain degree. But again, looking at religion as metaphor is much more a satisfying approach to me than any type of objective reality. Additionally, the other things that I took from specifically the Christian side of things is what it means to suffer, and looking at Christ in his crucifixion as this moment of pure giving up of oneself for another, right? And in that moment, Christ becomes lovable because you can relate to that in some sense, not obviously crucifixion, but the giving up. And you see humanity and its imperfections in others as the most kind of compelling and relatable element. And so it's loving somebody for who they are not, that I really took away from primarily that crucifixion story from the Bible. So to me, it's this identification of suffering. To share in that experience with others is really the only way to better understand the world around us, in my opinion. So these books that I read, they can get us in the door, right? But then you must see, you must touch, you must smell, you must dine with, you must dance with, you must do all of these things with others in order to truly experience what it means to live in their shoes, and in turn be empathetic, right? The intellectual curiosity, the study of these topics only gets you so far. It's that as a stepstone to experiencing their lives that it truly allows you to understand their experience in their suffering, which I believe to be, one of these paramount means of relating to one another. I'll stop there and see.
Yeah. Well, a lot of things we could talk about there for sure. So what you were just talking about here at the very end is this idea of really trying to live in their shoes and understand what they're going through, as opposed to it being more of just an intellectual exercise of trying to read about it and understand it from an intellectual standpoint. You may be familiar with Houston Smith. he passed away a few years ago, but he wrote a book called The World's Religions that I think he wrote, I want to say like in the 1950s. And what was interesting about him was he grew up, I believe, as a Catholic. His parents were missionaries, and I think a lot of his formative years were in China as his parents were trying to evangelize the Chinese. Well, what was interesting about him is he became a professor of religion, and he ended up spending 10 years living. It was at least the three monotheistic, I can't even pronounce that word, so I'm not even going to say it. So Christianity, Islam, and Judaism. So at least with those three, he spent 10 years living each of those. And I thought, well, gosh, that totally embodies what were just talking about here about trying to live those particular faiths. And I think toward the end of his life, he ended up sort of coming full circle and came back to Christianity. But he came back to it from an understanding of having lived other faiths. And also you were talking about with these particular three faiths, they're all pointing to the same God, and yet we've got different paths to get there. And I think maybe there's an analogy here with Bitcoin from the standpoint that people will say, well, Bitcoin is for everyone. But then we've got some people who say, well, everyone except progressives, or everyone except Marxists, or everyone except socialists, or everyone except this particular group. Well, I think the reality is, if we can maybe stay with this religion metaphor for a moment, is that we're all pointing toward the same place, but we may just have different paths to get there. And I think that's one of the unifying things about Bitcoin. And I don't want to take this too far with the religion analogy, but I think one of the interesting things about Bitcoin is that in many respects, I think it is a potential unifying force, the likes of which the world has never seen before.
I
Because
agree.
it can attract so many different people with so many different belief systems, but yet they can all coalesce around this one thing. And so that's one of the things that makes me really hopeful about it, is that it can be a force for peace as opposed to a force for division.
I absolutely agree. And I think what is happening is we are taking these old frames of reference, these old frames of looking at the world, whether it's ideologies or religions, and we're still mapping those onto Bitcoin because it's our way of understanding it, right? We each approach it from a different perspective. But the problem is when we hang on to those old systems of reference and project it forward into what Bitcoin should be, rather than trying to shed those old frames of reference and see how Bitcoin could be this more unifying force. I mentioned Joseph Campbell. He talks about this arguing for a universal myth to connect us all to the planet, right? Not necessarily a specific local group, not a myth to connect us to some local tribe. And I would argue that perhaps Bitcoin could be that thing if we are able to shed some of these old ways of looking at the world. I will take the religious element to Bitcoin a step further. And again, hearkening to Joseph Campbell, I think there is a certain way that Bitcoin is threading the needle between religion and secular society. And I'm not sure how that'll play out, but I think it's fascinating to consider. So you take people who come into Bitcoin and they dip their toes into it, they buy some, and then there's this ritual of needing to put your Bitcoin into cold storage, to going through that learning process, to take the money, to put it in a hardware wallet. The hardware wallet is almost like an icon. And learning about Bitcoin, you begin to question what you know, you begin to question everything. And then your faith in Bitcoin gets tested with the volatility, with the bear market. It's almost this rite of passage, right? And then you survive that volatility, you survive the bear market, and you come out the other end welcomed into open arms by the community who has been here for years and has weathered that storm. So I do think there's that ritualistic element to it, that rite of passage that is arguably missing in contemporary society because we don't have the mystical element of religion anymore. We have the formalities of religion. We get dressed and go on Sundays, etc. We don't have the mystical element. It's not pervasive in society anymore, and we're missing that ritual component. And perhaps to a certain degree in this technological means, it is a ritual, but it is most certainly a community. And so I think there is something more to that. And something I've been thinking about as of late, and I would love to tease it out more in the coming weeks and months.
Yeah, well, let's see if we can continue to tease it out here in our conversation here this morning. Um, so one of the things that you talked about here just a moment ago, you said that as each of us as individuals, we have our own experiences that have shaped our belief systems. We have our own worldview. And as we come into Bitcoin, I think you made a comment to the effect of we shouldn't necessarily take our preconceived belief systems, our lens, our worldview into Bitcoin and try and change or bend Bitcoin to how we see the world. It's really the other way around. And I also think of Bitcoin as an emergent thing, meaning if you take all of these different worldviews, all of these different perceptions, all of these different lenses, and they come into Bitcoin, who knows what's going to end up? Who knows how it's going to end up changing all these different people who come at it from totally different angles, but yet they're drawn to the same thing. What is going to come out of the other end? We have no idea. We can certainly speculate. So I think that's one thing to think about, is that I guess it's the old meme that you don't change Bitcoin, Bitcoin changes you. I think there's a lot of truth to that. And speaking of the memes and the metaphors, which you've touched on in terms of the metaphors, I was just reading an article by Ben Hunt from Epsilon Theory. I don't know if you're familiar with Ben or not, but he's written some really, I'm going to say, provocative or thought-provoking things. And one of the things that he wrote that I read this morning that is really relevant to what we're talking about here is he was trying to come up with a framework for how we should think about narratives and how we should think about the metaverse. And he tied it into religion, since we're talking about religion here. And what he was suggesting is that religion, and I'm probably going to get this all wrong, but I just read it this morning, so hopefully it's a little bit fresh. He was trying to suggest, I think, that memes and narratives are not just forms of communication to try and get a message across, but that they actually rewire our brains, and that they're actually, I think he was trying to say, physical things. And so we should pay more attention to the narratives. We should pay more attention to the memes. And he, again, was kind of going deep into religion with this in terms of the messages from Jesus and the prophet and folks like that. They weren't just stories. They weren't just parables. They weren't just metaphors, but they were ways to rearrange the molecules and the atoms in such a way that they essentially became physical things. And again, I'm not doing justice to what he wrote here, so I would certainly recommend folks to look up what he wrote as another potential lens to think about this. And as we think about Bitcoin, kind of bringing it back to that, obviously there's all kinds of memes that are thrown out there about Bitcoin. And when we think of a meme, one reason why they get so popular is because there's at least a kernel of truth in those, and a shorthand way to communicate perhaps a deep, thoughtful message. So we may think they're a little bit silly, but I think the reality is they could be much deeper than we actually think and much more impactful than we actually think. So a lot of different things, I think, swirling around here. I'm not sure that I'm making a whole lot of sense out of all of them, but that's why I have a podcast, so I can talk to folks like you, and in public we can talk about these things and see where they may lead us.
Well, the article sounds extremely fascinating, and I'm anxious to read it. And yes, I agree that I think it's easy to dismiss memes in a lot of what happens in the metaverse, Twitter land, Facebook, etc., as less than or not as important as the physical world. That obviously even plays out with our assets, right? Bitcoin is not as important because you cannot touch it, and therefore it is not as important. And so I think it's easy to dismiss what is happening with regard to memes, what is happening in social media because of that, because of its lack of physicality. But if this is what Hun's point is, I would certainly agree. We cannot dismiss that because clearly it is pervasive and affecting us. And I'm certainly not a dualist by any means. Whatever is happening on the internet and metaverse is affecting our brains, is affecting the molecules and neurotransmitters, et cetera. That's a given, right? Research has clearly shown that it affects mood and behavior, et cetera. So to dismiss it is the wrong way. And I certainly see that in the coming years, decades, as more and more of our lives are online, the question of who we are as a person starts to get blurred, right? We have the person here in the physical world, then we have our avatar online. That the lines between those two people will continue to be blurred, especially as you get into virtual reality. And there will be a time in the coming decades when perhaps your online avatar is more real than your physical person as it relates to how you function and exist in society. So to not to be discounted 1%. I would agree with Hunt that there's something to that we should be taking seriously for sure.
Yeah, and this whole idea of the avatar and the online profile. So I look at my Twitter feed, and maybe I'm following the wrong people, but there's a significant percentage of them that have a profile picture that's not their real picture. It's an NFT. And I know a lot of people in the Bitcoin space dismiss NFTs, but it's a real social cultural phenomenon that I don't think is going away because it ties so much into identity. And as you were talking about there, it's like, well, who am I really? Am I this real face, quote, real in air quotes here, that you and I are looking at each other? Or am I going to have some other picture that I post out there that I feel represents who I want to project to the public or to my community? And maybe I want to change my identity from time to time. In one community, this is who I am. In another community, I'm something else. So there's a whole lot of psychological things I think that can go into this. And because we do have this online communication and online media, I think this stuff is only going to get bigger. And who knows where all of this is going to lead. But I don't think the NFT phenomenon is going away. And I think the other thing about the NFTs is that there's a lot of communities that are being built around these as well. So when someone mints 5,000 NFTs or 10,000 NFTs and they spin up their Discord group, there's some real communities that are being developed. And I think, well, I know, we all crave a community. And I think that's one of the things that has made Bitcoin so popular as well, is that a lot of people that are attracted to it are finding a community of people that they want to surround themselves with and build things with and create lives with. So a lot of interesting things that are happening there.
Yeah, as far as NFTs go, they're not going away. I think more and more will be built on the Bitcoin network. I think the biggest hang up is that these are getting monetized to just ridiculous valuations, right? But the concept itself, I think, is valuable and important. And I think it's really going to take off as VR becomes more and more prevalent. I think NFTs, these non-fungible tokens within the virtual reality space, will be much more applicable than just profile pictures on Twitter. So it'll be interesting to see how that plays out.
Now, we started off by talking about these three broad areas where you ended up doing a lot of research over a number of years. And one of them was religion, one was racial justice, and then a third was money. So, as you kind of reflect on those and we think about Bitcoin, I'm always interested in hearing people's thoughts on what Bitcoin fixes. And I think you might consider yourself maybe more progressive, more liberal, and just social justice, racial justice issues, I think are important to you, important to me as well. How do you think Bitcoin fits into that? And what problems do you see Bitcoin fix from your standpoint, from the lens that you come into Bitcoin with?
It's a great question, and one I've obviously committed to solving with the starting of the podcast. And I think actually the answer is relatively straightforward. And I'll say up front that I think Bitcoin is the most progressive thing to happen in decades, and I'll explain why. So if you
And,
first
and
have to,
before you do that, can I ask you this? Can we get it to a definition? Because I think
yeah,
so many of the problems that we have in this world is people are operating under different definitions. So you say progressive, and someone says, "Well, you're a Marxist socialist."
right, right.
So, and everyone has a different definition. So, just so we're level setting here, how would you define progressive?
And that's exactly what I was going to get at. I think we need to define, you always need to define something as it relates to oneself, I believe. Obviously, there's going to be more of a universally accepted definition for some things, but it also is important to define what it means to you. So progressive for me is progressive with a lowercase p. What does it mean to individual people, to the plebs, not necessarily a capital P, progressive for the politicians who are hoping to continue their current power structure through government intervention. That is not what I'm referring to. So progressive to me, and the progressive values that I believe in, are helping historically marginalized communities, whether that's here in the United States or abroad, and climate change and the environment. Those are my two big value systems that I define as progressive values for me. Okay, and I don't think there's going to be a lot of debate in there. This should also be distinguished from progressive. Obviously, progressivism is a derivative of progress. But I think what is societal progress is a whole other ball of wax to dig into that isn't necessarily relevant to this conversation. So what I also want to clarify is those values that I just detailed do not oblige me to say that the means of obtaining those needs to be government intervention. That is the single most biggest hangup that I've found after launching this podcast, is that people automatically assume that because I believe in those things, I only feel that government intervention is the best way of tackling them. And that is absolutely false. So getting back to what I think Bitcoin helps with, I always caution fix. You first must define what is Bitcoin. And so for me, I simply say, it's an open, permissionless, non-confiscatable, private, disinflationary monetary network. All right. So if we accept that definition, to look at how Bitcoin is progressive, you just need to look at the opposite of those words. So what is a closed monetary system? Well, a closed monetary system is one where you are turned away because of the color of your skin, because of your historical standing, because of your color of your skin, one that is closed off to you for any number of reasons. And obviously for you and I, that's not as important. We have access to any asset that we want, but that is not the case for many African Americans and other people of color in the United States. And obviously it only gets worse as you go abroad. You move on to the next descriptor, permissionless. What is a permissioned monetary network? Well, one that you need to ask for to access. Bitcoin doesn't care, again, what your race is, what color your skin is, what your credit score is, whether or not you've been in jail, if you've ever been through a bankruptcy. It doesn't care how much money is in your checking account. Anybody can access it. Again, for you and I, that's not a problem. But for many people in the United States, it is. And again, it only gets worse as you move outside of the United States. Non-confiscatable. What is confiscatable money? Well, we all know the limits of FDI insurance. We know the limits of what it means to have stock ownership. We know what it means to live in Crete and wake up one morning and your money is gone. We know what it means to have your money taken at the border. So all those things are elements of a confiscatable money. You move on to the next one, private. Well, privacy is much like health in that you don't value it until it is gone. And so many people will say that I don't care about privacy. I have nothing to hide. Perhaps that's true, but I can assure you that the government, Facebook, etc., do care about every element of your life. And it is without a doubt, as we were talking about earlier, Facebook, Instagram, all these companies work hand in hand with the US government, and how easily manipulated we all are when using those platforms, right? So your data becomes something that can be used against you, even though you have quote unquote nothing to hide. Lastly, disinflationary. You and I, again, we have access to assets that protect us against inflation. Many people in the United States, again, do not. Again, only gets worse as we move abroad. So is Bitcoin progressive? If you look at the antonyms of all of those descriptors, I don't see how you can not argue that, again, Bitcoin is the most progressive force that we've seen in decades. And I'll put an asterisk in there again, that all those things I just described do not obligate any one of us who identify as progressive in the Bitcoin community, does not obligate us to believe that the government needs to intervene in some sense as such, right? The point is to remove government from that situation. And what that leaves you with is another conversation. But again, I think that fear, that concern should be assuaged by what I just said. It's if you can replace a system to affect better change more efficiently, why would you not want that, right? So did that make sense with regard to how I see Bitcoin as progressive?
It absolutely makes sense, and I think you stated that very eloquently. And I think the key thing is, and I think what a lot of people who say progressive and Bitcoin don't belong in the same sentence, I think where they get hung up with, as I think you said, is they're thinking that the progressive Bitcoiners are going to try and impose a government system onto Bitcoin to achieve their progressive values. And you're clearly saying, no, that's not it. What we're saying is Bitcoin has the properties, as you just outlined them there, that are extremely beneficial for a lot of people who have certain types of progressive values. And so you and a lot of the other progressive Bitcoiners see the way the Bitcoin system is designed as is, as I'm going to call it this life raft to further progressive values. And I don't think anybody could argue with that, because it's like we like Bitcoin as it is to achieve what's important to us. And with Bitcoin being the open system and all the attributes that you just described there, I mean, it's hard for someone to argue with that. And as we think about the literal definition of progressive, which is to move forward, to advance, I mean, that's Bitcoin. I mean,
Right.
and it's built on top of all of these other advancements that had been made for 20, 30, 40 years. And Bitcoin to this point is the apex of a combination of a lot of other technology that had already been in place, plus one or two more additions to it that Satoshi developed and combined them in such a way and unleashed it into the world at the exact moment that the world was ready for it. And a lot of things conspired to make this thing get to where it is today. So, yeah, I think you said that extremely well. I think it'd be hard for someone to argue against what you just said and say, hey, Bitcoin isn't for progressives.
Right. I mean, you and I, and a lot of the people who express these concerns, benefit the least from Bitcoin. The people who benefit the most are from the Congo or from Argentina or from Pakistan, all these other countries where a open, permissionless, non-confiscatable, private, disinflationary monetary system is a hell of a lot more advantageous than it is for you and I, right? So I think that gets discounted to a greater degree than it should be, and I understand the concern about, again, how progressives have been viewed historically and what it means for government intervention. And this is what gets back to what we were talking about earlier with regard to these frameworks that we bring forward and project onto Bitcoin, for better, for worse. I think it's going to take several years, if not, a generation, whereby these frameworks, progressive, libertarian, conservative, et cetera, eventually fade away. And the youth right now will just see Bitcoinism, in whatever that means in the future. And the reason why we have these discussions now is because those are the models by which we understand the world up until now. And the most fascinating part is trying to shed those models and think forward of what could be. I think this discussion of what is progressivism, et cetera, is boring. It's not productive. Let's project forward and see what kind of society may come to be, what kind of belief systems may come to be under this banner of Bitcoin, under this universal myth that connects us to the planet that is Bitcoin.
And that's hard to do because all we know is what our past experience has led us to be and believe up to this point. And so to imagine what could be, I mean, it might be fun as a exercise, but I think it's hard for a lot of us to just really kind of project on, well, what could this be? But I think that is so important. And again, I think that's one of the amazing things about Bitcoin is that with its emergent properties, we don't know what it's going to evolve to. But I think we're off to a really good start from the standpoint that so many different people from all over the world with all different backgrounds, all different experiences, all different belief systems, all different religions, all different political views can come together. I mean, I don't know of any other thing that comes even close to bringing such a widely diverse group of people together toward a common thing. And again, that's why I'm hopeful about it. So I do want to talk about you being a doctor, because you've been on the front lines here for a long time, and particularly in the last couple of years. I definitely want to talk to you a little bit about some of your experiences here in the era of COVID. But before we get there, I want to talk about your podcast a little bit. So tell me about the podcast, and I'd love to hear some of the things that you've learned. You've had some amazing guests, so I'd love to hear what are some maybe new insights that you've picked up, or existing beliefs that have been reinforced, or maybe some things that have really opened up your eyes about, I hadn't really thought about it that way before. Tell me a little bit about the podcast.
The podcast is The Progressive Bitcoiner. I started it a little over a month ago now. And well, actually, I think it's a month to the date. That was the release of the intro episode. So there's been just about a dozen of us on a separate Twitter chat group, and over the past 6 months or so, just sharing ideas and trying to, again, look at Bitcoin through those progressive values. And so one thing led to another, and I am always somebody who asks questions later and takes risk, and I'll figure it out as I do it. And so I pitched the idea, a couple of months ago, we should do a podcast, and nobody really took to it. And I said, okay, well, I'm going to do it. I've got the time and means to, well, time is a relative thing for me with a toddler and the work, but nonetheless, I wanted to make time. How about that? And I felt that there was a need for it, a desperate need for it, because a lot of the concerns and bad takes were coming from the left. And you could easily see how it was becoming a political issue. And that's obviously the last thing that we want to have happen. In addition, as we talked about already, I think it helps progressive values. And lastly, I wanted the personal challenge of the research, of the task of interviewing, the extemporaneous speaking, all of those things I wanted to work on and take on the challenge. And it has paid that in spades. I have enjoyed it thoroughly. Talking to people and hearing their stories has been so refreshing. I did not expect to have that um, come from just even these first 5 episodes. Every time I leave, have an interview, I'm energetic and thrilled, and I'm an introvert, and so usually talking for an extended period of time, I'm cashed, and I want to I want to go to sleep. But I'm pumped, as I will be after this interview. As far as things that I've taken away, I think right now, since I'm still a rookie, uh, it's hard for me to really sink into a conversation and learn from it in that moment. It's much like when you're a cyclist, a competitive cyclist, and you're racing through beautiful scenery. So I was racing through through Spain and the Pyrenees, and just gorgeous scenery all around you, but you're hyper focused on the 2 inches in front of you of the person's wheel so that you don't crash, or you're barreling down a mountain at 60 miles an hour. You don't see the beautiful scenery beside you. So I think it's very similar in how I'm starting out with podcasting here. I'm so hyper focused on the questions that I'm asking and making it a good interview, then really learning something in that moment. Going back through has been helpful, but I think that'll come with time and experience where I can actually immerse myself in the podcast and not be in a competitive race during the interview. But I I've always been a curious person, and that curiosity I think is helpful in the interview process. A deep curiosity and respect for the person that you're interviewing, and really trying to tease out their story and what moves them. I think ultimately the single thing that I've taken away from just the 5 episodes that I've done is that for these people and for all of us, Bitcoin is not just an asset class. There are deep emotions and commitments to Bitcoin, to this network, to the good that it can do. And from the outside, that may look odd, obviously, but it also takes a curiosity from the listener to be able to say, why would this thing that I only associate with as money and volatile, why is that so important for that person? So I think it's twofold. One, you can understand just how much Bitcoin means to people, but I hope that that meaning in turn translates to the listener to be curious as to why it is important for that person, and allow that listener to take a step uh, through the door to say, why? Let me better try to understand this person's story, their reality. Why is Bitcoin important to them? Perhaps it might be important to me. So after 4 episodes, I'm pumped. I can't wait to do more. Who knows how long this will last, but I'm excited for the ride. That's for sure.
Yeah, well, I'm with you 100%. As you know, I have a number of podcasts that I do. I've been podcasting since 2014. I think I've done close to 500 episodes now, and almost all of them are interview shows. And like you, I'm just super curious about a lot of different topics, and been interested in Bitcoin for quite a while, and started my show here that folks are listening to about a year ago. And just the insights that you get in talking to people like you. I mean, we're having a very interesting conversation. I'm learning things, and it really adds to the collection. One of the things that you said there that I do want to touch on a little bit more is you talked about cycling, and I think you were a competitive cyclist. I think you still do a lot of cycling, and so one of the things that I have been doing for about 20 years is climbing mountains. And the first one that I climbed was Mount Rainier, and my objective on that first climb was to get to the summit. And so just like you say, when you're cycling, you're probably going 30, maybe 40 miles per hour, maybe 50 miles per hour going downhill, and it's all in a blur. And so when I'm climbing, all I see is like what's right in front of me. And we'll typically do the summit push in the middle of the night. We've got our headlamp on, and all we see is this little illuminated piece of glacier right in front of us, taking a step, and you can hear the crunching of the snow and the ice as you're walking. That's all you see. And what I realized was after that first climb was I didn't appreciate the fact that here I am in an amazingly beautiful place. I'm healthy. I'm with fun people. This environment, this climate was incredible. And I didn't really appreciate it to the degree that I could have because I was so focused on getting to the top. So after I got down and, a few days of reflection, I thought, if I ever do this again, I'm never going to go again with the goal of getting to the top. I'm going to go with the goal of just absolutely paying attention to everything around me, to the people that I'm with, living in the moment. And if I get to the top, great. If I don't, that's fine too. It's the old journey, not the destination thing. And so once I came to that realization, I've done a bunch of trips since then. They've all been fabulous. Not everyone has led to the summit, and that's totally okay because it's about that appreciation. And I think that's one of the things about podcasting is, like you say, it's like I love to go back and listen to the show because then I pick up a lot of nuance and I think, oh, I wish I would have asked this question, or I wish I would have gone a little bit deeper into that particular tangent. And I think it is such a craft, and we're kind of diverging a little bit here from the topic at hand, but I think it's important that it's a larger point of curiosity, as you mentioned, reflection, appreciation, and understanding, and taking time to do those things and reflect. And I think that's how we learn, that's how we grow. So, kind of end of my my little rant there.
Oh, I got my daughter coming up. We're gonna have to.
That's all right. We'll get her on the show.
Because I just wanted to watch the other part on Wednesday.
Come here. Daddy's working right now, but I want you to say hi to Daddy's friend. Say
Hello
hi.
there.
Hi,
Hi, what's your name?
Estelle.
Estelle? That's a pretty name.
Daddy's working for a little bit. Would you go grab Mama? I think what you're talking about also makes me think about what I was referring to earlier with this idea of being able to relate to each other. And I know that this idea of self-sovereignty is incredibly important in the Bitcoin community. Out of breath, running up the stairs. Have to edit that out. The idea of self-sovereignty being important in the Bitcoin community, and I believe it is undoubtedly. But why is it important? It's not only important because of what it allows for you, but what it allows for others, right? So the idea of self-sovereignty, a monk in a cave, right, is self-sovereign, but does nothing good, arguably, for the world. So it's always in relation to others. Our freedoms, our liberties are always in relation to others. And so while self-sovereignty is important, it is only important in so much as it allows you to better understand and relate to others. And so to your point, this experience of podcasting gives you that bridge to better understand people. I can prioritize my self-sovereignty, but it only takes me so far if I'm not able to better relate to my family, to my community, my peers, on up. Does that make sense?
It does. And that brings up a whole nother issue. And this is something, honestly, that I've struggled with when it comes to self sovereignty and just to what degree. And I think maybe that's where I struggle is, yeah, I believe in the idea of individual choice and freedom and that sort of thing. But I also believe we live in community. And to get to your point here is that life is no fun if it's just all about me or it's all about me being able to do what I want to do without necessarily taking into consideration others. Now I know that's like an extreme, and I don't think that's what a lot of us think of when we think of self-sovereignty, because I think we all pretty much do want to be in a community. And I think maybe that's a nice segue to another tweet that you sent out here recently where you said, it would appear every generation has its grand delusion. And I think you were referencing COVID denial. So I'd like to talk about that, and maybe find a way to tie it in um, to Joseph Campbell, and his famous book, Hero with a Thousand Faces, Power of Myth, with Bill Moyers, um, and Bitcoin and money in terms of, well, is money just a shared illusion? I think there's maybe a lot of different threads. So let me just stop there. And again, being a doctor, you've been on the front lines. Do you have enough distance at this point to maybe create some perspective for what you've seen, maybe what observations or comments that brings to mind about human nature? Does it make you hopeful for the future? Does it concern you about the future in terms of how people have been behaving? So let me stop there and see if you have any thoughts on that.
My tweet about grand delusion, was a yes in reference to denying the existence of COVID, denying the existence of the Holocaust when it was happening, denying the severity of Vietnam, all these events where there was a denial of the experience of others. And so while somebody outright denying the existence of COVID is rare, I certainly have patients that have experienced that and won't believe that they have it. And you're like, all right, that's fine. You're able to have that belief. But there's definitely a distinction between that and having concerns about how the government has handled the whole situation. That is understood and a rational thing to be concerned about. I think you were wanting to touch on why I think people have avoided the vaccine. And this again goes to spectrum too. It's a risk benefit analysis, whether you believe that to be a rational assessment or not. It's the mandate nature of it. I have many people who, when I've asked, why weren't you able to get it? They said they've just been too busy. It hasn't been a priority. And that's understandable too, when you're working two jobs and there's not enough slots at Walgreens or CVS to be able to schedule one. Like, I think we've done a terrible job of being able to provide access to testing and the vaccines for the United States. My experience has been a bit of a pendulum. Early on, it was just the energy, the fear that drove you. And so at that time, we're talking about February, March, April of 2020, just wasn't there. The politics weren't a part of the experience in the hospital. And so the frustration with everything was not as prevalent. But then you get to the end of the year and you get to 2021 and the vaccine's been rolled out. We have a better understanding of the pathology. We have a better understanding of the treatments. And yet we're still faced with the same situation as we were when it first came out, right? And there's been ebbs and flows of of the virus and how many people are in the hospital. But that's when the frustration set in, and just the day in, day out dawning of all the equipment that you need to put on, the calling of families who can't visit their loved ones to tell them that their 29-year-old son just died. In the last thing that they saw was my face saying, "You may not come off the ventilator." Having conversations like that with mothers, fathers, sons, daughters, day in, day out for the past 2 years has been incredibly excruciating for everybody. And there's no understanding of that unless you're in it. And since it's probably been over the past 2-3 months, I've come back to a point though where I can take a step back and be more present with my patients. I've never felt I'm in the position to judge them in any manner. I do not know their life experience. I do not know what they've been through. I do not know what has driven them to make the choices that they've had, that they've made, nor am I in the position to judge them. So I want to at least give them that grace as they are clearly suffering, and allowing myself to step back and in that position, I think has done wonders for at least my mental health. So I'm not caught up in the politics of it anymore. I'm not caught up in the data or any of that. I'm just there to do my job for each and single patient that I encounter, and I do my best.
Well, first of all, I want to thank you. I mean, I can't imagine what you have to go through as a doctor on the front lines for the past 2 years. I mean, we see pictures and we hear stories, but to hear you share it the way that you did there, I think really brings it home. And I want to say thank you to you and everyone that you work with, all the frontline people, all the doctors, all the nurses, all the administrators, for what you have to put up with. And so I appreciate that. I think another thing I want to mention is that one of the things that to get to what you're saying here, that COVID has helped reinforce to me, that I've had a greater appreciation of over the past few years, is how, because we're so polarized in a lot of different areas, it's like, okay, well, if I believe A and somebody else believes the opposite of A, rather than just saying, well, they're really dumb. Why don't they believe what I believe? To your point about having more grace, that's something that has certainly developed in me in recent years, again, reinforced through COVID, is that, like you say, I don't know someone's story. I don't know their background. I don't know their experiences. But what I've come to acknowledge is that they are, quote, self-sovereign. They do have a belief system that brought them to a point where this is a decision that I want to make. And I hear people say that I would rather die than have the government tell me that I have to take the vaccine. We're seeing a lot of people on Twitter who are saying, I have to move out of Canada, or I have to move out of Australia because I can't go to a restaurant because I would have to show my vaccine card. And so, like you, I'm not here to judge those people. I'm hopefully maturing where I can have more grace and appreciation and understanding that they've come to that decision. And I don't want to just draw this to COVID or the vaccine. I think I'm trying to make a larger point here about understanding people who are very different from you, who have different belief systems. It's like, let's not demonize the other. Let's just understand that there's a reason why they believe what they believe, or they do what they do. Again, assuming they're not criminal or anything. I'm not talking about that. And Yeah, again, that's something that I think I've grown in over the past few years, is understanding that they've come to their decisions for reasons. I need to respect those reasons. I'm not going to demonize them. And yeah, so I think that
I
that's one of the lessons I've learned out of this.
No, I agree. And of course, I was hoping for some Independence Day miracle where Will Smith would show up and we would all unite us and overcome this virus. And it would have been a thing of the past a year ago, but it's not. And I accept the fact that this is our position in history right now. This is the bad, the evil that is inevitable in our lives, and to think that it could not occur, that it could not happen, is just naive. And so I'm willing to accept that that is something outside of our control. It just is. It is the yin and the yang of our lives. Um, and it's bad luck, right? For a lot of us. And that's okay. We have to be okay with that. And especially in the United States, like, this is the balance between um, freedoms and equality, and the one taking from the other. And there's, what's the balance between those two things? And it's always a struggle, and that's okay. That's what it is. I think this does relate to, just taking it back briefly to Bitcoin, that there's always going to be the good and the bad. You know, one policy, one law may be good for you, but it may be bad for somebody else, right? That's just the nature of things. But I think that has become more exacerbated in contemporary society because of the fact that the world, the United States specifically, is so incredibly complex, and to manage a complex system from a centralized government is just not going to work. And so if we can have a more decentralized network, i.e. Bitcoin, perhaps that will smooth out the good and the bad. There will be less downside for us all. The tide will have risen. Getting back to your question about COVID and people's willingness to die to not get the vaccine, I think this is the most interesting question of them all, as it relates to COVID, that is. And I've come to believe that the answer is because not accepting the vaccine ties back to who that person sees themselves as. Not taking the vaccine reinforces some identity in whatever core fundamental belief system that person has. And for that to break is more painful than the perception of death, right? Because death is not tangible. You're not faced with it until you get it and are in the hospital and ICU at that time, right? But up until that moment, it's still an abstraction. But what is real is to have a schism in your identity. And the defense of that identity, in my opinion, is a stronger force than the thought of death. So the ultimate point is that you can't argue with that. You can't argue with somebody's wanting to defend their identity. It's not a rational argument to have. It's much like trying to argue with somebody's faith, right? It's just not going to go anywhere. It relates back to self-destructive habits, right? They make no rational sense to an outsider, but to that person, whatever behavior that is reinforces something for them that gives them security or pleasure. And the negative downside is still less than whatever that is. So again, it's not a form of logic that you can necessarily argue with. You just have to be, again, a step back, and I think a bit more of a Socratic approach to it, playing out the counterfactuals in the situation is much more productive than telling somebody what they need to do. And I don't want to seem apathetic to, obviously, the severity of the situation, but trying to change somebody's mind is not going to work, right? So I often like to just ask, what were your thoughts be if the virus had been more deadly? What if it targeted youth instead of children? Or excuse me, what if it targeted the children and youth rather than uh, elderly? What if there was a specific genetic predisposition that made it worse for you and you had that genetic predisposition? Would you feel differently about the vaccine or other uh, protocols and mandates? What if comorbidities were protective? What if Trump had been pro-vaccine from the beginning and had pitched it as a patriotic thing to do? Would your thoughts be different? I think those questions lead to a more productive conversation than, again, telling somebody what they should feel or do. I had a patient early on. He was in his mid 70s, and he came in with COVID, and it was pretty mild at the beginning. He was in the hospital for 3-4 days at the most. We got him off of oxygen. He was on steroids, which is a mainstay of treatment. And so I went to discharge him from the hospital, and I said, I want to send you home on steroids and a blood thinner because we know that COVID can predispose to blood clots. And so I was going through the medications that I wanted to send him home on, and he said, he started to question the meds and why should I be taking those? I don't think I should be. And he didn't believe them. And he says, the sources that I've been listening to don't agree with that. And I said, that's okay. And I tried to, again, explain the data behind it. It just he wasn't buying it. He didn't want to have anything to do with it. And then the other thing that he came in with was actually a new diagnosis of type of leukemia. So he was not acutely sick in that moment, but he was definitely going to need close follow-up with the oncologist. And so after kind of going back and forth with him about the rationality for taking the medications, I just said to him, or asked him rather, are you going to have the same logic when you go to the oncologist and he or she prescribes you medicines to treat your leukemia? And he didn't have an answer. And so I pose that question to people as well, like where does your mistrust end, right? Does it end with just COVID medicines, just the vaccine? Does it extend to other medications? Does it extend to procedures? Does it extend to Tylenol and ibuprofen? I see more complications from Tylenol and ibuprofen than I have any side effects from the vaccine. So I don't, again, I pose those questions to get to extend the conversation in a non-judgmental manner, because we are certainly not having those conversations in public. I'll stop.
Well, I mean, so many things that we could talk about here. One of them that I want to touch on is you shared some of your observations here about people who might say, I would rather die than take the vaccine. And one of the ways that I frame that, at least for myself, is I think of it as like a values hierarchy, where, to your point, you're saying this is their identity. And for them to say, well, I'm going to take this vaccine, would be more internally disruptive to them than it would be to die. And so they've made a values hierarchy that basically says, this is like at the top of my hierarchy, where I'm not going to let the government tell me I have to do something, or I don't trust these institutions. I don't trust that they have my best interests in mind. They're about power, and they're about this, and they're about that. They don't care about me. They just want to control me. And so I'm not here to judge, because they've come to that through their life experiences, through the sources that they listen to. And so I think that's one of the things that I've become a little more empathetic about is, who am I to judge? And, while I make a different decision, they come to their conclusion, and that's okay. So I think that's one thing. A second thing, and you were touching on this here right at the end, is this lack of trust in institutions. And I don't know how we're going to get around that as well. I guess maybe the institutions have to be more honest and more open. But I think that's, of course, one of the things that people are really attracted to Bitcoin about, is because there is no institution behind it. There's no one that we have to trust behind it. It's this trustless, permissionless decentralized system. And I think that's one of the things that's really attractive to a lot of people is I don't have to trust some elite person on the East Coast or someone in Washington, D.C., that they are going to have my best interests in mind, or Big Pharma is going to have my best interest in mind. So I think there's a lot of factors that ultimately go into this, and we're not going to end up solving all the world's problems here. But I think by having these kinds of dialogues, hopefully, it can help listeners maybe have more empathy, more understanding for the fact that we're all different and we all make different decisions. I think where COVID gets particularly difficult is if someone's decision has a negative impact on someone else, the externalities there. So that obviously has made COVID particularly complicated there.
I absolutely agree with what you're saying. One of my frustrations with how everything has been handled is that ordinarily, procedures and medications are a conversation that you have with your physician. And there's that one-on-one communication with that person to discuss the risks and benefits and to go through any concerns. The whole idea of informed consent, you explain all of those things before proceeding with an intervention. And that was completely sidestepped in this whole process. And in turn, you have, the media outlets basically projecting what you should be doing, which I think was a terrible mistake. I don't know how it would have been able to roll out within the clinics. I get that. But nonetheless, I think that element, that lack of one-on-one dialogue with a person that you trust, assuming you trust your physician, was a terrible mistake and probably could have resulted in more informed decisions. So I agree with you. You have to defend the right to rationality, right? We're all subject to that. And if you don't trust the institutions of the government, do you put 100% faith in your own decisions? Well, I think, clearly it's been proven that we always don't make the most rational choices, but that is from an outsider perspective. And what you believe to be rational is such. It is rational for you, and you cannot argue with that. And it goes back to this defense of one's identity, because you make those rational decisions based upon what you believe to be best for yourself. And obviously, when there's externalities based upon that, things get complicated and troublesome. But it's the hope, obviously, that we can have a bit more, as we said, grace and empathy towards each other. And this line of communication will lead us there, rather than trying to point fingers at each other, because it's not only liberating for the recipient of the person to be judged, potentially judged, right? They don't feel judged. That is much more welcoming to them, obviously. But for the person who does not judge, and I suspect you feel the same way, it is incredibly liberating. It is such a better space to come from than anger or righteousness, or you need to prove something. It's incredibly joyous, and even if the topic itself is filled with the anger and emotion, being able to come to it with that perspective is so liberating. Again, not just for the potential recipient of the judgment, but the person potentially imparting it, and stepping away from that, I've found, again, is a big part of why I think over the past few months I've moved into a different headspace and have not taken it on as emotionally or personally.
Yeah, I think we all just want to feel like we're being heard. And you touched on the Socratic method here just a little bit ago. One of the things I've also come to greatly appreciate is that when someone enters into a decision, a position, a view, a belief, if they enter into that through not necessarily a logical, rational means, then for someone to try and convince that person to change their belief, their view, using logical data, rational information, it's just not going to happen. And I see that that's so much of the fights that we see on Twitter, the fights that we see in the media, is one side says, well, here are the facts. And then the other side says, well, here are my facts. And it's like, Well, whose facts are you going to believe? Well, I'm going to believe my facts. I'm not going to believe your facts, because a lot of times will enter into a decision based on a complex mingling of emotions and experiences that we're not going to be talked out of because you're showing me some better facts. Now, sometimes that happens, but oftentimes it doesn't. So, humans, we're messy. And COVID, I think, has just shown how messy we are. And I think ultimately we all need to have more empathy and respect for each other. And I try and take a default position to see the goodness in people,
Mhm.
and that people have good intentions until they prove me otherwise. And I think, again, I don't want to moralize here.
Well,
uh,
I
um,
should have sat down with that patient that I was talking to. I should have sat down and teased out where he was coming from and given him the time to express his concerns more succinctly, however long that took. I don't know if I would have gotten through to him, but I can confirm whether or not he ended up taking the medications that I prescribed him. But he died. He died a week later, and so you always look back and hope that, uh, or think that you could have done more. That's a constant um, demon that hangs over every physician. What more could I have done or asked or tried to do? And you always I try not to let that be as burdensome now these days. It would wake me up at night, early on in my career. But now you use it as a tool to constantly build and build and build and become better at um, helping people, working with them.
yeah. Well, let's switch gears here just a little bit. So I think you're in your early 40s, and I'd love for you to maybe project forward to 50, maybe 60, as you think about where you might see yourself. You're a doctor now, you're very much into Bitcoin, you've got a podcast, you take care of your health. How do you see the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years unfolding for you?
The reason that I chose hospital medicine is because it allows for a diversity of experience. I thought about going into surgery for the longest time, and that's what I really wanted to do. But I recognized that I could not commit to being a surgeon, because when you're a surgeon, arguably that is the first priority in your life, and everything else comes second, because it is a craft that requires constant attention and practice and so forth. You can't part time being a surgeon. And my personality is such that I have, again, curious and a diversity of desires and experiences and things that I wanted to do. And I did not see a life of a surgeon allowing for that. And so, to that end, I don't see myself being in hospital medicine for the next 20 years either. And so I am currently working on another business with a colleague of mine, where we will provide online, virtual lifestyle medicine to clients. And so that is focusing on the social determinants of health, exercise, nutrition, sleep, connections, things like that, which are the primary drivers of health, right? So many people assume that genetics are the primary driver, and that's not true. It makes up about 15 to 20% of what determines your health. Your lifestyle, again, those things that I just listed, make up anywhere from 60 to 70% of your health. So we we want to solve healthcare, quote unquote, yet 10% of what determines your health, approximately, from a medical perspective, is excuse me, just is 10%. 10% of your health is determined by what I do, the medical care that you have access to. Right. So we're plowing these billions and billions and billions of dollars into that 10%. And we wonder why we're not making progress. And so it's been over the past several years, not only living that lifestyle, but seeing that I'm just putting band-aids on chronic disease, that I really want to try to better help individuals prevent, manage, potentially put into remission these chronic diseases such as hypertension and diabetes through lifestyle changes. And so this is something that I don't want to have solely just be a brick and mortar clinic. I want it to be online. I want it to be something that scales nationally, and onboard additional providers, physicians, to help people make these sustainable changes. So as far as my own personal health, I've tried to live this way for for my entire adult life. I have a terrible genetic predisposition to heart disease, so trying to mitigate those risks as well. But the most important thing to understand about your nutrition and health is that it's not all or none. You screw up one day and you have a pizza and some candy. It's like, it doesn't throw you off, right? It shouldn't throw you off. Chronic disease develop over years and decades, and one mistake one day should not throw you off to your commitment for better health. And so it's about making these incremental changes, moving closer to those better choices consistently over time. It's the consistency and the ever increasing attention to those things as they become easier and easier in your life. And when you fall off the wagon, it's beginning again over time. And that's what I really want to help reinforce and empower people to take on. In addition to that, I want to obviously be able to cut back to a minimum in my current job. That would be the goal, if not entirely stop completely. And then follow other passion projects. I have no idea where the podcast will go. It's already led me to talk to people that I would never have expected. So I can only imagine where that will go. And to the entirety of this, it's the point of the entirety of this conversation about the experiencing of others. I want that experience to, I want my daughter, whom you just met, to have that experience, those experiences in spades. I want her to be able to be an even better person than I, if I am that. So that's my hope for my coming decade.
Well, it sounds like you are working on trying to treat the cause of health issues as opposed to the symptoms. Because as a doctor, right now, you're mainly getting someone when they've got the symptom and you're trying to treat the symptom, but you're going back to the root cause of lifestyle. And what can we do to have a better lifestyle, which is going to lead to better health, which is going to prevent a lot of these chronic diseases, which are actually preventable. So that's great. And then you mentioned your daughter, leaving a legacy here, and I think you're doing a great job, and obviously a great model for her in terms of the work that you're doing as a doctor, and then these other things that you're working on too, with the podcast, with the business here of trying to develop a scalable system to help people live better lifestyles. So I think those will all be tremendous legacies that your daughter's going to be very proud. So Mark, why don't we go ahead and wrap up here? Is there any final thing that you want to mention? And also, I want you to mention your podcast again. And if folks want to get connected with you, what would be the best way for folks to connect with you? Of course, Twitter, I think, is going to be one of those too.
Thanks again, Steve, for the opportunity to sit down and chat. It's been a lot of fun. It's been a fantastic conversation. So I'm grateful for the giving me your platform. Thank you. Yes, I started the Progressive Bitcoiner podcast a month ago. You can find it at theprogressivebitcoiner.com, where we also have other resources, articles, podcasts, and videos that touch on progressive related issues. And it's been very well received. People from all over the world have reached out to not only add content to it, but to express gratitude for being able to consolidate that information and to express their belief that Bitcoin can help those causes as well. So yeah, I appreciate your listeners checking it out and providing any feedback, sharing any content that they may want to add as well. So I appreciate it very much.
All right. Well, thank you, Mark. Thank you for the work that you're doing as a doctor. Thank you for the work that you're doing here with the podcast, and appreciate you taking a lot of time with us here today. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve.